My name is Margo Hayes, and I was 34 years old the first time I heard my mother tell a stranger I was the practical one. She said it at a garden party, the summer after I graduated college, the kind of gathering where people wore linen and held wine glasses by the stem. My mother had a way of saying practical like she was complimenting the plumbing. It was the word she used for the daughter who paid her own tuition, who worked the night shift at a 24-hour pharmacy during finals, who never asked for a dime, even when her car broke down on the interstate, and she had to walk 2 miles to a gas station in the rain. I was the one who kept the family calendar, who remembered birthdays, who called the insurance company when my father's policy lapsed, and he didn't notice until he needed a prescription filled. I was the one who handled things. My sister Corinne was the other one. Corinne was the one my mother introduced with a hand on her arm and a story about her art gallery internship in Paris. Corinne was the one whose photograph sat in a silver frame on the piano. Corinne was the one who got the bedroom with the bay window and the window seat, while I slept in the converted den with the pull-out couch that always smelled faintly of mildew, no matter how many times I washed the sheets. I don't mean that as a complaint. I mean it as a fact. Because for 34 years I believed that being practical meant I didn't need to be loved in the same way. I believed that competence was a replacement for affection, that reliability was its own reward. I believed my mother when she said, "Margo, you always understand," because it sounded so reasonable. It sounded like she was giving me credit for something. She wasn't. She was giving me permission to be treated as less, and she was telling me I should be grateful for the opportunity. Visual: garden party table, linen napkins, a silver frame on a piano in the background. The first time I remember understanding what I was worth to my family, I was 8 years old. My parents bought Corinne a horse, a palomino named Daisy, 14 hands, boarded at a stable 20 minutes from our house. Corinne had been taking riding lessons for 3 years, and she was good at it, or at least good enough that my parents could tell their friends their daughter was an equestrian. Daisy cost $9,000. I know that number because I found the checkbook on my mother's desk when I was looking for a pen, and I saw the memo line. Daisy got boarding for 6 months. That same year, I asked for a new winter coat. Mine had a tear in the lining, and the zipper only worked if you held it at a specific angle. And I was tired of standing in the school parking lot in December, with my arms crossed over my chest, trying to keep the wind out. My mother said we couldn't afford it. She said we had to be practical. She took me to Goodwill instead, where we found a puffy blue jacket that was 2 sizes too big and smelled like someone else's perfume. I wore that coat for 3 winters, and when I finally outgrew it, I passed it to my cousin Lauren. I don't remember being angry. I remember thinking my mother was right. I was the one who could manage with less. It was a skill, like knot tying or long division. The second time I remember, I was 16. Corinne had decided she wanted to be a chef. She'd never cooked anything more complicated than toast, but she'd watched a documentary about a restaurant in Barcelona, and she announced at dinner that she was going to culinary school. My parents talked about it for weeks. My father made calls to a friend who knew someone at the Culinary Institute of America. My mother started pricing apartments in New York, where Corinne would need to live if she got in. They were proud. They were excited. They were the kind of parents who would have moved mountains for the daughter who dreamed in color. That same semester, I was accepted into an early college program for math and engineering. I'd been taking advanced courses since middle school, and my guidance counselor said I had a real shot at a full scholarship somewhere. I brought the letter home. And you did coffee. I put it on the kitchen counter. Now, so boy. My mother glanced at it between sips of coffee and said, "That's nice, honey." Then she asked me to fold the laundry. Oh, Corinne's cooking school applications got a folder. They got a timeline. They got a celebration dinner at the restaurant Corinne had never been to, but had seen in the documentary. My acceptance letter ended up under a stack of mail, and I never saw it again. I still got the scholarship. I still went to school. I just did it without them. Visual. Kitchen counter. Stack of mail. One letter half hidden under a grocery list. By the time I was 22, I had a degree in structural engineering and a job offer from a mid-sized firm in the city. I was the youngest junior engineer they'd ever hired. I designed retaining walls and foundation systems, boring things that kept buildings from falling down. I liked it. I liked the math of it, the certainty, the way you could calculate exactly what a beam could hold before it failed. I liked that my work was invisible but essential, that nobody noticed it unless something went wrong. It reminded me of home. That was the year Corinne's art career didn't pan out. She'd spent 2 years in Paris and come back with a French accent she'd developed in the last 6 months, and a portfolio of paintings that looked like someone had spilled a box of crayons on a canvas. My parents were kind about it. They said the market was tough. They said she had time. They said she'd find her path. She moved back into the bedroom with the bay window and the window seat, and my mother made her breakfast every morning while Corinne scrolled through jobs she was overqualified for and refused to apply to. I was the one who found her a job. Not an art job. A job at a gallery, as an assistant to a curator who was a friend of someone I'd done a favor for. I made the call. I vouched for her. I told the curator Corinne was detail-oriented and reliable, which were not words I would have used to describe the sister who had once left a gas stove on overnight and only noticed when the fire alarm went off at 3 a.m. But I said it anyway, because that was what I did. I made things work. Corinne got the job. She hated it. She called me every night for the first 3 months, complaining about the filing, the cataloging, the way the curator made her get coffee, even though she had a degree in fine art. I listened. I told her to stick it out. I told her it was a foot in the door. And when she finally got promoted to assistant curator, she told our parents it was because of her hard work and her natural talent, and my mother beamed like it was the first good news she'd heard in years. Visual. Desk phone, coffee cup, a stack of file folders. I never told them I was the one who'd made the call. I never told them I'd followed up 3 times, making sure the curator actually looked at Corinne's resume. I didn't need the credit. I was the practical one. I was the one who didn't need praise. Here's what I did need, though. I needed them to stop bleeding me dry. I don't mean money. I mean time. I mean energy. I mean the invisible engine of maintenance that kept the family running, the one nobody noticed until it stopped. Because over the 13 years between my college graduation and the week I'm about to tell you about, I became the family's default administrator. I handled the tax filings. I managed the annual homeowners association payments. I kept track of the property insurance. I made sure the car registrations were renewed. I updated the calendar. I coordinated holidays. I reminded my father about his doctor's appointments, and my mother about her book club, and Corinne about every birthday, every anniversary, every event she was supposed to attend. 13 years. I did this for 13 years, and not once did anyone say thank you. Not once did anyone ask if I was tired. Not once did anyone notice that I was the reason the family stayed tethered to the ground instead of floating off into chaos. And this is the part that's hard to explain, because it sounds like I was a martyr, and I don't think I was. I wasn't doing it for gratitude. I was doing it because I was good at it. I was doing it because somewhere along the way, I internalized the idea that if I wasn't useful, I wasn't anything. If I stopped being the one who handled things, who would I be? What would they need me for? That question was the mechanism. I just didn't know it yet. Visual, calendar, red ink, filled in dates, a sticky note on a fridge. The mechanism itself came in the form of a trust, a family trust that my grandmother Vivian had set up when she was still alive, before the Alzheimer's took her memory, and then her voice, and then everything else. My grandmother was the one person in the family who'd ever looked at me like I was more than a utility. She was the one who'd taught me how to balance a checkbook, how to read a contract, how to spot the hidden clause in a lease that could sink you if you weren't paying attention. She'd been a property lawyer in the 1970s, a woman in a field of men, and she'd built a small fortune out of stubbornness and careful reading. She'd never liked my mother. She'd told me once, when I was 16, that my mother had married into the family and spent every year since trying to forget that her own roots were in a working-class neighborhood where nobody had a house with a bay window. My grandmother had seen it. Now they do. She'd seen what I was to them. She tried to warn me, but she was gentle about it, and I was young, and I didn't understand what she was saying until it was too late. The trust was a piece of paper that nobody in my immediate family read carefully. My grandmother had left a substantial sum to my parents, with a portion earmarked for me and Corinne. But there was a clause in the document, buried in the middle of the legalese, about a property my grandmother owned. A cabin in the mountains, 89 acres of land with a creek running through the middle. The only thing she'd ever bought with her own money before she'd married my grandfather. The trust specified that if the cabin ever needed to be sold, I had first right of refusal. It specified that I was the sole authorized signatory for any transaction involving the property, including the payment of taxes, the maintenance of utilities, and the extension of any lease or licensing agreement to third parties. My parents didn't notice this. They didn't read the document at all. They signed it, filed it away in a safe deposit box, and forgot it existed. Because why would they read it? They had lawyers for that. They had people who handled things. They had me. Visual, safe deposit box, a folder tied with ribbon, yellowed paper. The thing is, my grandmother had told me about that clause. She'd told me when I was 19, in a whisper that was losing its clarity, but not its strength. She'd said, "Margo, you keep your name on that property. You keep your name on everything that matters. They'll try to take it from you, not because they want it, but because they want you to have nothing." I didn't really understand what she meant. Not then. I thought she was being paranoid. I thought she was old and afraid and projecting her own fears onto a family that wasn't that complicated. I was wrong. By the time I was 34, The family had made a plan. It was a plan I wasn't told about, a plan I discovered by accident, because Corinne's fiancé, a man named Parker, with a weak chin and a stronger trust fund, had the habit of sending emails to the whole family group chat about things that weren't intended for me. Parker was in private equity, a job he'd gotten through his father, and he and Corinne had decided they wanted a mountain wedding. Not just any mountain wedding. They wanted my grandmother's cabin. They wanted the 89 acres with the creek running through the middle. The property my grandmother had bought with her own money. The property I'd been quietly maintaining and paying taxes on for 13 years. They didn't ask me. Oh? They announced it at a dinner. My mother's house, the dining room with the china cabinet, the table set with linens that were probably worth more than my first car. Corinne sat at the head of the table like a queen giving orders. She said, "Parker and I have been talking, and we think the cabin would be the perfect place for a small ceremony. Just family. Very intimate." She looked at me when she said just family. No. My mother nodded. My father nodded. Parker nodded. Miriam? Nobody looked at me to see if I had something to say about the property that had been solely under my name for over a decade. Visual. Dining room table. China plates, wine glasses, silverware arranged precisely. I said, "The property taxes are due next month. I handle those." My mother waved her hand. "We'll handle it. Don't worry about it." I said, "The utilities are in my name. The water, the electric, the propane." Corinne said, "We'll switch them over. It's not a big deal." I said, "The land itself is in my name. That's what the trust says." There was a pause. A real one. The kind that sits in the air and makes the silence feel thick and uncomfortable. My mother and father exchanged a look. Corinne's jaw tightened. Wow. Parker looked at his plate like he just remembered he had somewhere else to be. My mother said, "Margo, you always understand." There it was. The phrase I had been hearing my whole life. The one that meant I would fold. I would accommodate. I would step aside and let them have what they wanted because I didn't need it the way they did. She said it like it was a gift. She said it like I should be grateful she'd acknowledged my willingness to be small. I didn't say anything. I looked at the table. I looked at the family I had been holding together for 13 years. The family that had never once asked me what I wanted. The family that treated me like a tool they could pick up and put down as needed. I thought about my grandmother, who had seen this coming. I thought about the cabin, which I'd never really wanted, but which I'd kept safe and maintained and paid for because it was the only thing that was truly mine. I said, "Let me think about it." My mother smiled. She thought she'd won. She thought I was just the same practical Margo I'd always been, the one who understood, the one who made things work. Visual. Empty dining room, the family leaving the table. One seat still occupied by Margo Doshia. I went home that night, and I pulled out the trust documents. I read the clause again. I reread the whole thing, every page, every subclause, every technicality my grandmother had built into the language like a trap for people who didn't read carefully. And there it was. The mechanism. Not a grand weapon, not a secret account full of money, not a private detective with a folder of damning evidence. Just a phrase in a legal document that said I had sole authorization to make decisions about the cabin, and that any transfer of interest required my signature, witnessed and notarized, with a 30-day waiting period. Nobody in my family had ever read that part. They'd assumed the trust gave my parents control. They'd assumed I was just the daughter who paid the bills, the daughter who managed the logistics, the daughter who never said no. I was 34 years old, and I was done being understood. The next 3 months I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I said I'm considering it every time someone asked. Corinne called me once a week. Yeah, my mother called me twice. My father sent me an email with a subject line that said request and nothing else. They wanted me to agree to transfer the cabin. They wanted me to sign a document that would let Corinne and Parker use the property for their wedding. They didn't mention that the transfer would also take the cabin out of my hands permanently. They didn't mention that once the property was theirs, they wouldn't need me for anything else. And I realized during those 3 months that my silence was making them angry. Not because they needed my approval, because they were used to getting my cooperation without asking. They were used to me folding, and the fact that I wasn't folding was starting to become a problem. Corinne showed up at my apartment, unannounced. She stood in my doorway in a cashmere coat that cost more than my rent and said, "Margo, you're being ridiculous. It's just a cabin. It's not like you ever use it." I said, I use it. I go there twice a year. She said, "You work there. You bring your laptop, and you do your boring engineering stuff, and you don't even enjoy it." I said, "That's not the point." She said, "The point is Parker's family is going to be there. The Whitfields. Have you met them? His mother is a collector. His father is on the board of 3 cultural institutions. This is a big deal for us, Margo. This is the wedding we've always wanted." I said, "I'm glad." She said, "Then why won't you help me?" I said, "I'm thinking about it." She left and I closed the door, and I sat down at my kitchen table with my grandmother's trust documents, and I realized I was no longer thinking about whether to say yes or no. I was thinking about what it would feel like to say no and mean it. Visual, kitchen table, trust documents, coffee mug, a pen lying sideways on the paper. The wedding was scheduled for late September, and Corinne sent out invitations to 200 people. She picked a weekend. She hired a caterer. She had a dress shipped from New York. Nandale wanted you. All of this was done without my signature, without my approval, because in her mind, the cabin was already hers. She told everyone it was family property. She'd told her future mother-in-law, the collector, that it was a legacy property, a place her ancestors had loved, a testament to her family's history. She hadn't mentioned that her grandmother had bought the land with her own money. She hadn't mentioned that her grandmother had been a lawyer. She hadn't mentioned that the family who loved her had spent 13 years pretending I didn't exist. I didn't tell her. I let her plan. I let her spend money. I let her build a narrative about the Whitfields, about the image she wanted to project, about the beautiful mountain wedding she would host in a cabin that belonged to me. Because I knew what was coming. I'd been waiting for 3 months. I'd been waiting my whole life, if I'm being honest. I'd been waiting for a moment when I stopped being practical and started being present. The day before the wedding, Corinne called me. She was frantic. Her voice was high and tight in the way it got when she was stressed, the way she expected me to fix. She said, "Margo, The caterer needs a final head count, and the florist needs access to the property tomorrow at 6 a.m. And the rental company is asking about liability insurance. Can you please just sign the transfer document? It's just a signature. It's just one signature and then it's done. Mine. She said, Margo, you always understand. The phrase again. The second time spoken in context of a logistics problem, a need she thought I would solve because I always solved things. She was right. Down. I understood everything she was asking. I understood exactly why she needed me to sign. She needed me to sign so she could feel safe, so she could feel like everything was under control, so she could feel like the cabin was hers to show off to the Whitfields, to the collectors, to the collectors, to the people who mattered. I said, I understand. She said, great. I'll send you the document. You can sign it tonight. I said, no. There was a pause, a silence. She said, what? I said, no, I'm not signing. She said, Margo, what are you talking about? We're leaving in 6 hours. The wedding is tomorrow. You can't do this to me. I said, I'm not doing anything to you. I'm just not signing. She said, you always understand. You always... I said, I understand perfectly, Corinne. I understand that you're only talking to me because you need something. I understand that you've never once asked me how I'm doing, or what I want, or whether I'm happy. I understand that you think I'm just a function, a service, a set of hands that can handle things for you, while you get all the credit, and the celebration, and the love. Nah, I know me, man. Well, me. She was crying. I could hear it in her breathing. She said, that's not true. I said, it's true. You know it's true. But that's not why I'm not signing. I'm not signing because the property is mine. My grandmother left it to me. She left it to me because she knew you would try to take it. She knew you'd act like it was yours. She knew you'd plan a whole wedding around a piece of land you've never paid a single tax bill on, a property you've never maintained, a place you've never even visited without complaining about the cell service. Me? She said, I'll call Mom. I said, go ahead, call her. Tell her I said no. Tell her the wedding is off unless you find another venue. She hung up. I sat in my kitchen, looking at the trust documents, and I thought about my grandmother. I thought about her voice, fading, but still clear, telling me to keep my name on the things that mattered. I thought about the cabin, the creek, the quiet mornings I'd spent there with my laptop and my coffee. I thought about how nobody in my family had ever asked to visit. Nobody had ever asked to spend time with me there. They'd wanted the property. They'd wanted the image. They'd never wanted me. Visual, kitchen table, trust documents, Margot's hand resting on the paper, her grandmother's photo in a frame behind her. The next morning I drove to the cabin. It was 5 hours from the city, through the mountains, past the town where my grandmother had grown up, past the road that led to the cemetery where she was buried. I arrived at 8 a.m., the same time the florist was supposed to show up, the same time the rental company was scheduled to deliver chairs and tables, the same time Corinne's wedding was supposed to start taking shape. The family was already there. My mother stood on the porch, wearing a cream-colored dress, and an expression of utter disbelief. My father was parked next to the shed, talking on his phone. Corinne stood on the lawn with her arms crossed, flanked by a man and a woman I didn't recognize. The Whitfields. I walked up the gravel path. I was wearing jeans and a button-down shirt. I had a folder in my hand. The trust documents, the ones they'd never read. My mother said, "Margo, what are you doing here?" I said, "I live here." She said, "The wedding is at noon. The guests are arriving at 11:30. You can't be hearing that." I gestured at my shirt. "In this?" She said, "You know what I mean. You look like you're about to clean the gutters." I said, "I am. After the wedding. But first I need to talk to everyone." Visual. Cabin porch. Gravel path. Margo in jeans. Folder in hand. Corinne in a wedding dress. Eyes red. I walked onto the lawn. Corinne was crying. She'd been crying all night, probably. Her eyes were red, and her mascara was smudged, and she looked like someone who'd just realized that her plans were based on a lie. She said, "You are going to ruin my life." I said, "I'm not going to ruin anything. I'm going to tell the truth." The Whitfields were watching. The woman, Mrs. Whitfield, I assumed, had her hand on her husband's arm, and she had the kind of composed, interested expression that comes from a lifetime of hosting awkward social situations with grace. She said, "I'm sorry, I don't think we've met." I said, "I'm Margo, Corinne's sister. I own this property." Corinne said, "She doesn't own it. It's a family property. It's in a trust." I opened the folder. I pulled out the trust documents. I read aloud the clause my grandmother had written, the one that named me as the sole signatory, the one that gave me full control over the property. I said, "I've been paying the taxes on this land for 13 years. I've been maintaining the utilities for 13 years. I've been the only person who's ever taken care of it. It's legally mine, and it has been since my grandmother died." Corinne said, "You didn't tell us." I said, "You didn't ask." My mother said, "This is absurd. Your grandmother would never have done that. She was confused. She was sick." I said she wasn't confused. She knew exactly what she was doing. She told me about this. She told me the year before she died. She said, "Margo, they'll try to take it from you." And she was right. Mrs. Whitfield said, "May I see those documents?" I handed them to her. She read them, careful and methodical, the way my grandmother would have read them. Her husband peered over her shoulder. They exchanged a look. Mrs. Whitfield said, "These are legally binding. Miss Hayes is correct. The property is hers." Corinne's face went white. My mother's face went red. My father just looked tired. Mrs. Whitfield said, "I'll need to cancel the floral arrangements, and the rental company, and the caterer. We'll find another venue, of course, but it won't be here." Corinne said, No, we have 200 people coming. 200. We can't cancel." Mrs. Whitfield said, "You can't have a wedding on property you don't own, dear. That's a liability issue. And frankly, it's a matter of trust." She said, "Trust the way my grandmother would have said it, with weight, with meaning." Visual, a cabin lawn. Whitfield's reading documents. Corinne crying. Mother frozen. Margo with a folder at her side. I looked at Corinne. I looked at my mother. So I really. I thought about the 13 years of unpaid taxes, the 13 years of invisible labor, the 13 years I'd kept the family running, while they'd told me I was just the practical one. I said, I'm not asking for an apology. I'm not asking for anything. I'm just telling you the truth. The wedding can't happen here. It was never going to happen here, because I never agreed to it. Corinne said, You always understand. The phrase, the third time, delivered at its most public, its most confident, with Mrs. Whitfield standing right there, watching her daughter-in-law to be beg her sister for a favor she didn't deserve. I said, I do understand. I understand everything. And then I walked away. I walked up the porch steps, past my mother, past my father, past the porch swing where my grandmother used to sit in the summers, watching the creek. I walked inside the cabin. I closed the door. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't give a speech about the pain they'd caused me, the loneliness, the 17 years I'd gone to bed wondering why I wasn't good enough, why I wasn't lovable, why I was only ever needed when there was work to be done. I just closed the door, and I took out my phone, and I called the lawyer my grandmother had recommended years ago, the one who'd handled the trust, the one who'd been waiting for me to make this call. I said, I'm ready to file the paperwork. The property stays in my name. The family is not authorized to use it for any purpose. He said, I'll have the documents ready by Monday. I said, thank you. I stayed in the cabin that night. I heard the sound of cars leaving, the gravel crunching under tires, the fading voices of my family as they drove away. I heard Mrs. Whitfield say something to Corinne, something low and sharp, something I couldn't quite hear but recognized as the sound of a person learning that the family she was marrying into was not what she'd been told. And I sat on my grandmother's porch swing, watching the creek, and I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't being useful. I was just existing. It felt like a revelation, like a door opening, like the weight of 13 years lifting off my shoulders and dissolving into the mountain air. Visual, cabin porch, creek at dusk, porch swing, glass of water on the railing. The next week was chaotic. Corinne called me 27 times. My mother called me 41 times. My father called me twice, and both times he left voicemails that were just him breathing into the phone before he hung up. I didn't answer any of them. The wedding happened eventually. They found a venue in town, a small church that could only hold 70 people. Corinne sent out an email the night before, explaining that the original venue had unexpected complications. The Whitfields came, but they left early. Mrs. Whitfield made a point of coming up to me after the ceremony. She'd tracked me down. I didn't even know how she knew I was there. She said, Your grandmother was Vivian Hayes, wasn't she? I said, Yes. She said, I knew her, years ago, before she got sick. She was a remarkable woman. She told me once that she had a granddaughter who was going to be an engineer. She was very proud of you. I didn't know what to say. I'd never heard anyone say my grandmother was proud of me. I'd always assumed she was just being kind. Mrs. Whitfield said, This was never about the property, was it? This was about something else entirely. I said, I don't know what it was about. She said, I think you do. And I think your family is going to spend a very long time learning to live without you. She walked away. I stood in the back of the church, watching Corinne and Parker say their vows, watching my mother pretend she wasn't mortified, watching my father try to figure out where he'd gone wrong. He didn't know. He'd never known. He'd been too busy letting my mother handle things, letting me handle things, letting everyone else handle the work of being a family, while he stood on the sidelines and signed checks. I thought about the call I'd gotten that morning. My mother's voice, high and desperate, saying, Margo, your father's insurance is about to lapse. The payment didn't go through. I need you to check the account. I said that's not my responsibility anymore. She said, What do you mean? It's not your responsibility. I said, I've been paying that bill for 13 years. I've been paying a lot of bills. The auto insurance, the homeowners association fees, the property taxes on the house. I've been managing everything while you've been telling everyone I'm just the practical one. I'm done. I've already transferred all of the accounts back to you. The logins, the passwords, the auto-pay settings, they're all in your name now. No. Done. She said, We can't handle this. You know we can't handle this. You're the one who... I said, I know what I am. I'm the one who handles things, and I'm done handling them. I hung up. I didn't wait for her to argue. I didn't let her use the phrase again. I just hung up, and I sat in my apartment with the phone in my hand, and I realized that the silence was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. Visual, apartment, phone on the counter, silence, a single lamp on a side table. A month later, my father called me. He called me on a Tuesday, which was unusual because he usually called on Sundays, when my mother was out of the house and he could speak freely. He said, Margo. I said, Dad. He said, You know your mother is going to be angry for a long time. I said, I know. He said, She's not going to forgive you, not for what you did. I said, What did I do? He said, You embarrassed her. In front of the Whitfields, you made her look small. I said, She made herself look small. I just refused to be smaller. He was quiet for a long time. I could hear him breathing, the same way I'd heard him breathing on the voicemails he'd left that week. He was trying to figure out what to say. He was trying to find a way to make me feel guilty, a way to pull me back into the orbit of the family, a way to make me be the person they needed me to be. He said, She does love you, you know. She just doesn't know how to show it. I said, I know she loves me. I know that's what she tells herself. But love doesn't get to be the thing that makes it all okay. Love doesn't get to erase 13 years of being invisible. Love doesn't get to be a substitute for respect. He said, What do you want me to say? I said, I don't want you to say anything. I just want you to hear me. He didn't answer. I think he understood, for the first time, that I wasn't asking for anything. I wasn't asking for an apology or a reconciliation or a family reunion. I was just telling him the truth. And the truth was, I was finally free. Visual. Phone. A single kitchen chair. A lamp. The silence of a quiet apartment. I still go to the cabin. I go every few months when the city gets too loud and I need to hear the creak and feel the weight of the mountains around me. I bring my laptop. I do my work. I sit on the porch swing and watch the light change. Corinne hasn't spoken to me since the wedding. My mother only calls when she needs something, and I stopped answering those calls 2 months ago. My father sends me emails sometimes, about the weather, about the garden, about things that don't really matter. I reply sometimes, short and civil. I don't know if that's kindness or just habit. But I know this, I'm not the person I was. I'm not the practical one, not in the way they meant it. I'm not the one who understands. I'm the one who walked away. And that is the only thing that matters. My name is Margo Hayes, and at 34 years old, I learned that being practical doesn't mean being invisible.